Good afternoon, folks. We are here for another virtual panel, this time on OpenStack Summit that was held in Boston last week. This is Krish Subramanian, founder and chief research advisor at Rishidot Research. And I am having a pretty good panel here, though a couple of people couldn't come join the panel because of some personal issues. But this is definitely going to be an interesting panel. And I expect some fireworks, especially with Rob and Ben in the panel. There has to be some fireworks. So I hope these guys don't sort of disappoint me. Okay, let's start with a short introduction and then get into the panel questions. Rob?
Hello, my name is Rob Hirschfeld. Sorry about the background noise, but I'm at a conference. I am CEO and co-founder of a company called RackN, specializes in underlay automation. And I was on the OpenStack board for a long time. I've been involved in the Kubernetes community, the cluster ops side. So, you know, super involved in these communities and open source pieces like that. So, and I got to present in the Kubernetes track a couple of times at OpenStack. So talking about Kube under OpenStack and Kube on OpenStack. So got super deep there.
Ben?
I'm Ben Keeps. I'm a analyst, commentator, pundit, I'm not sure which. Yeah, I've been watching OpenStack since day one, pretty much, back in the day when everyone was so excited and positive.
Swarna?
Hey, I'm Swarna Padilla. I had product marketing at a company called Avi Networks. Have been watching the OpenStack community from the sidelines for at least the past 3 years, but have been involved in a little bit of marketing contributions slightly after I joined here at Avi Networks. More active on the Kubernetes side, or rather Cloud Native Computing Foundation side. So just watching these open source communities evolve and seeing both of these come together was at least brand new for me. And this was my first OpenStack Summit, so it was a very good experience for me.
So since you are a newcomer to the OpenStack community, probably I should start the question with you. What is your general feeling about the conference, and what do you think are some of the interesting announcements you came across there? And for others, especially Rob and Ben, we have been following this OpenStack movement from the very beginning. So I would expect you both to compare this conference in terms of momentum, in terms of the buzz, everything, with the previous conferences. But since Swarna is new to the community, probably she can talk about what is her first impression.
First of all, just the general conference feel was completely different from typical trade shows or the industry conferences I've attended, like AWS reInvent or VMworld or those kind of the larger conferences. It was more of the actual contributors that were walking the show floor, since I spent most of my time on it at the marketplace. It was just interesting to see that there were a lot more doers than just decision makers or the higher level C-level kind of audience than what I would see in a typical conference. The OpenStack, at least adoption perspective, I saw that there were a lot more OpenStack in production kind of deployment conversations rather than we're just kicking tires. It shows the maturity of the adoption as well. I think I can barely count the number of conversations that I've had on one of my hands where they were just kicking tires, or they were just introduced to OpenStack, or the directive was to go the OpenStack route and they were at the conference to learn about everything, to learn from others. So it was just starkly different to see the comparison between, or the difference between the other typical trade show conferences versus OpenStack. The one thing that at least stood out for me, or the two things rather, one was the focus on communities, I mean, for all the right reasons, but focus on bringing the rest of the communities as well, not just OpenStack, but bringing OPNFV, the networking summit, the Kubernetes kind of communities together. So it was that kind of combined focus or a collaborative focus that I really appreciated. But the other thing that stood out for me, at least, was from the feedback that I've heard all these years about how technical the conference is. I felt that this time, I don't know if it, I will defer to Rob and Ben later, but from what I saw, it was not quite as technically involved audience this time. Maybe it could probably be my super high expectations from a technical audience perspective, but there was mixed audience. I mean, it was both technical and business side of the audiences together. I mean, I guess goes on to me as well. The fact that a product marketing person was at the event for the first time this year kind of probably is reflective on that as well. So I'm not sure if there was a specific reason for that, or if it was more on the more reflective of the adoption curve. Like there's more production deployments now, so it's more of a larger business discussion rather than the actual technical discussion. So it could be because of that, but would love to hear Ben and Rob's thoughts as well as to why that difference exists now, if it is, and how the previous years were.
Yeah, Ben, you could kick off, like you were there for the Analyst Day, I guess. It's been San Diego Summit since I attended OpenStack Summit. So probably you could kick off on your thoughts and probably take it from West or Nalek.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been to, I think, every summit for the past, I don't know how long. And I've got this perennial blog post that I write after each summit, and it's always, is OpenStack a thing? And this year I don't need to do that because OpenStack certainly is a thing. But unfortunately, what we're kind of seeing is the questions around it, is OpenStack a commercial thing? And it was interesting for me, we saw Boris Rensky from Mirantis on stage kind of doing his kind of marketing thing about complexity, and then we had Jonathan talking about about decoupling and what that looks like. But the reality is that OpenStack is absolutely being used. It's being used in production. Obviously, famously, CERN uses it, but there's lots of really good case studies of how OpenStack is being used. But I don't think anyone's making any real revenue out of OpenStack. I heard some kind of mumblings around Red Hat's revenue and kind of a little bit of clarity around how much they're actually making out of OpenStack. But suffice it to say, it's not much, and generally it's because they're selling something else on top of or underneath OpenStack. So I think it feels to me like the event was smaller, but part of that was because they broke out the design summit separately. But I think that OpenStack is at a crossroads, and my kind of concern or my interest is that a lot of the big sponsors are dropping out. And so what does it look like in terms of the foundation going forward? Because that's an expensive thing to run. And so I'm not really sure how the OpenStack initiative and foundation will look in a couple of years' time once all of those big vendors have dropped out, and it's more kind of the Chinese companies and the telcos that are there. So that's kind of my thoughts.
Okay, so you bring in some interesting points about how the foundation is going to look in a few years. That is one of the things I have been watching too. So at least from the press release I saw, there are still 20 gold members. So isn't that a good number to take it to the next level? Or do you think that's going to dwindle really fast? So I do agree with you that more and more the new members who are joining are Chinese telecom or some other company from the Asia Pacific side. So probably maybe that is where the future of OpenStack is, with Amazon and all the public cloud providers gaining traction here, and a handful of companies in the United States getting the market share for US customers. Maybe the future for OpenStack is only in Asia Pacific or probably some parts of Europe. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think there's two questions. One is, what is the future of OpenStack as an initiative? The other is, what is the future of the foundation? And I have no knowledge, but I would imagine that a lot of these new sponsors are paying a hell of a lot less than a lot of the sponsors from a few years ago when there was frothy amounts of VC money, around OpenStack. So in terms of what is the future for the initiative, I mean, it'll carry on. It'll kind of look like a sub-project of the Linux Foundation or something like that. It'll just be kind of one of the many things, one of the many open source initiatives that exist. But I don't think it's going to be kind of the big razzmatazz deal that we have seen for the past few years.
Okay, so
I'll
Yeah, Rob, this will be a good point for you to jump in and. Yeah.
I've been making notes. I got a little set of notes. These are great points. Wow. OpenStack, it's funny. Ben's entirely right. The gold membership is changing. It's really shifting to Asia, secondary markets, right? A lot of the U.S. companies are chasing containerized orchestration and platforms. Right? It's a wave difference. And we are seeing a lot of telcos coming in, and they're the ones who are really invested in OpenStack right now. Although I just saw an article float across about AT&T, right, questioning AT&T's commitment even. Although all these OpenStack, X is pulling out of OpenStack or Y is pulling out of OpenStack, or sort of this circling desire to find people who are pulling out of OpenStack. And Ben, I think, was entirely right. We are seeing significant traction, real market adoption, real use cases. It's not exponential, but it is significant and it's real. And at the same time, we are seeing vendors who've pulled out or decommitted, who couldn't find the revenue sources from OpenStack. And that's troubling for the foundation. When I look at that, what I see is that, in 2011, when OpenStack was starting, we were very excited about this infrastructure revolution and cloud washing everything. And we thought that people were really going to care about cloud infrastructure. And the reality is they don't. Most people don't want to deal with cloud infrastructure. They want working plumbing. But the number of people who are going to get excited about OpenStack is really a subset of the market. And to me, that this is the correction that we've been waiting for, where it's not, you can't wave OpenStack and have everybody go, hey, this is super exciting stuff. It's like, all right, I deal with infrastructure. I need open infrastructure. I want to talk about open infrastructure. And then you have a whole bunch of people who's like, I don't want to deal with infrastructure at all. OpenStack should be dead because I don't care, right? I don't want to know. And so it's sort of this readjusting of people finding what their interest level is and moving away from OpenStack because they're not interested at that level of the data center cloud ecosystem. So I think that's a really significant thing. The foundation has done a really nice job with the board and the TC collaborating. This is meetings that happened before the summit, but you saw the effects of really saying, look, we are not the infrastructure. We are a part of the infrastructure. And so they had these tracks for Kubernetes, they had tracks for Open Daylight, they had tracks for Open Contrail. I mean, they became a forum for adjacent projects in this summit. And so I think, the attendance is smaller. There's a lot of competing events, but at the same time, they came back and really took that event and turned it into not just the OpenStack show, but an open infrastructure show. And looking forward, I think that, we do need a home for open infrastructure conversations and all the adjacencies and pieces and parts that OpenStack had so far unified, but we're seeing disintermediated, that's the right word for this, by things like Kubernetes that also need software-defined networking and software-defined storage and a lot of the same conversations. So we're in this really interesting transition where OpenStack is shrinking, which a lot of us wanted it to do, getting more focused on certain key use cases and embracing the adjacencies that they need to do. It's not all, there's headwinds without a doubt, but this summit, OpenStack bent its trajectory from the way it had been going from Austin and from Barcelona, which is significant.
I think you made a pretty good point about the correction that is needed and that we have been expecting for some time. I think that is, I fully agree with that. There was a need for correction, and OpenStack is doing right now. But in fact, a few years back, like I think it's 2+ years back, when I was part of Red Hat and when Kubernetes was taking off, I was of the opinion that OpenStack Foundation should be hosting the Kubernetes project rather than at the time letting it run as an individual project, because I thought the thing has moved, the train has moved beyond the OpenStack as an infrastructure platform to containers and container orchestration. Instead, they were focusing on their own project to manage the containers and all that. I forgot the name. Backspace, Red Hat, and a few others came up with the project. I think Ben knows it. He recently had a conversation back and forth with Duncan. Yeah. So do you think that was a missed opportunity? And with all this you are talking about, what is going to be the nature of OpenStack Foundation? Is it going to stay small and nimble, but become the forum for talking about adjacent infrastructure opportunities, or like Ben said, it is going to be a component of the bigger umbrella, which is the Linux Foundation?
Yeah. I think we have to go back to Ben's question about how the sponsorship funds are going to play into it. Because Ben's asking the exactly right question. Who's putting money into the OpenStack Foundation separate from the other components that are there, right? There's now, what last year was foundation year, and it's not clear that there's funding for all the entities to continue sustaining individual foundations during individual projects. Ben, do you have an idea on that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of your Kubernetes question, Krish, I mean, the reality is that can you imagine Google have ever allowing Kubernetes to come under the OpenStack Foundation? So I think my sense is that there were two things going on there. That Google, when it set up Kubernetes, or the initiative, would have never allowed that to come under OpenStack. And I think back then OpenStack was sufficiently confident that it didn't need, Kubernetes was this little thing that no one would care about, and it was, OpenStack, it was the alternative to AWS, and so why would there be any need to kind of do that? As it happened, that isn't the case. But I think what it's created is this, and there was that argument with Duncan, and there was a lot of discussion. I heard Kote's podcast yesterday where he was kind of laughing about, being confused about whether it's Kubernetes on top of OpenStack or OpenStack on Kubernetes, or, it's turtles all the way down. And it feels like two things. It feels like a science project, like we can do stuff just because we can, or we'll do stuff because we can. And it also feels like positioning. And, despite these things not being commercial in that, in theory, it's an open source initiative and doesn't need to think about commercialization, commercial realities. The reality is that the OpenStack Foundation is a business, and so it needs to kind of position to maintain some relevance. And so in an ascendant Kubernetes world, it will try and work out how OpenStack is still viable. Whether or not that's actually valuable for customers is unfortunately seemingly a little bit secondary.
Okay. So yeah, I think this was a discussion which I wanted to have at a later stage, but I think we started off with a bang. So before we talk a little deeper on Kubernetes being the big thing in the event, so I want to ask all of you about what is your favorite announcement from the conference. Let me start with my favorite announcement was some talk about edge computing in the end, because I think OpenStack has a reasonably good role in the edge computing world, where the edges can be powered by OpenStack, whereas the public cloud remains at the core, kind of a thing. And so finally, OpenStack community is waking up to that, and there is some. I think there was a bit of the session there, and there's going to be further talks about how OpenStack can play into that kind of a paradigm. And then the second interesting announcement is the marketplace for managed private clouds. I think that should have come long back, in my opinion, like when those days in circa 2012, when I was pushing for the federated cloud kind of future, like this is what I was hoping to happen, but finally they are talking about it. But the number of companies participating in that space is still small. Like I would love to see the foundation putting some efforts to sort of ramp up the number of companies offering this private cloud as a managed offering. That will sort of solve multiple cases. One is about the regulatory hassles, which where companies want to have data inside a country's border, but they don't want to manage infrastructure. Then it will also help in the edge computing use cases. So I think that is something they should push forward further. So these are the two announcements that caught my eye, other than the usual announcements about some of the customers doing this, that, and things like that. So I would like to hear your opinion on it. Swarna, you have been quiet for some time, so you want to start with it? You are muted.
Yeah, sure. I was looking for the unmute button. I think the edge computing definitely was something that at least piqued my interest coming from a networking side of the world. I'm not sure if it's an announcement per se, but just the fact that we had real users on the stage, like the US Army, their use case was definitely something that intrigued me. On the edge computing side, I think I remember Beth from Verizon presenting the quote unquote OpenStack in a box type of thing. That was pretty kind of an interesting, not announcement per se, but a pretty interesting concept for me to grok from a Verizon or from an end user use case perspective to see how they are using, or how they at least are making it easier for themselves to deploy and kind of use Kubernetes. OpenStack.
Yeah. Now we know which project is getting a lot of traction.
Yeah, no, just a little jokes aside, but at one point I did feel that it was a Kubernetes conference with an OpenStack focus. It definitely felt that way. But all jokes aside, but I think the edge computing and the marketplace announcement, as you said, were the two announcements that definitely caught my eye as well.
It didn't feel that way. It was the Kubernetes conference.
Okay,
It was
I'm
the
glad I'm
Kubernetes
not alone.
Operators Conference.
We are going to have a discussion about that pretty soon.
Yeah. So if I got the con, so the two things that I thought were interesting. One is projects are leaving Big Tent. So it wasn't really advertised very heavily, but there's an acknowledgement. Just so people know, I've been advocating against Big Tent. I think it was a horrible move. I've been very vocal about this, and there's an acknowledgement that Big Tent was not helping, was confusing messages, wasn't dealing with things that there were things that people wanted it to accomplish, but there are side effects. And so I'm watching Big Tent getting rolled back. I'm watching projects leave. I'm watching the foundation admit that it's not providing the value that they were hoping. That could be an hour-long conversation in itself. But more importantly, I think you're entirely right on the edge computing piece. Seeing people deploying OpenStack on small infrastructures on the edge, I think is really an interesting thing. To me, it's not a slam dunk. It's right. We've got serious issues with managing OpenStack clusters in that distributed way. We haven't solved that. The underlay issues in managing distributed edge infrastructures is abominable, right? You can't manage edge as standalone clusters, and there's no concepts of distributed management. So this is an area that there's significant need for, but tremendous operational gaps for what they're doing. I talked to those teams and other teams who were doing edge, and they really want the OpenStack API so that they can automate these distributed infrastructures, but they don't, the ideas of what they're actually going to do to manage it are way behind. So it's a great example of use cases driving discussions, and people are doing some cool things for OpenStack, but it feels very round peg to me. Right, you look at what Kubernetes and containers are doing, and there's such a more obvious fit for small environments than OpenStack, which has a lot of weight to it, and a lot of complexity and a lot of management. And I have some serious, head scratching, where as I'm watching, this use case emerge, and trying to figure out, if that's the right way to do it, if OpenStack is really going to be there for that challenge. It's a very different set of use cases. So, but I do agree, it's probably the most significant set of use cases that we saw emerge out of this conference.
So Ben,
it's funny because like you, Swan, I kind of liked the Army training school example or case study, but that's because it was kind of a cool case study, and they were doing nimble, agile stuff that you wouldn't expect a military organization to do. But was it really, was that the best example of mass use of OpenStack? Like if that's kind of as good as we get, that's pretty depressing. The other thing that I found kind of weird was there was the again really cool, like the woman that was presenting about the robot thing, like the self-folding robots, which was amazing. Like it was really super cool. But I actually tweeted, and Lauren So actually replied. I said, what on earth does this have to do with OpenStack? And she's, oh, well, they use OpenStack as their infrastructure, which is kind of like, so, like it's kind of like AWS saying, at reInvent, getting some startup with 2 people from some godforsaken hole like New Zealand, saying, oh, these guys use AWS, therefore AWS is a thing. So I was kind of a little bit weirded out by that. I mean, I think like the eBay stuff with, like the stuff we're seeing at scale, that we're hearing about at scale, is good, but I do worry that about the dearth of kind of really good chunky case studies for OpenStack in production.
Okay. So before we go to other questions, I want to go back to the edge computing topic and probably pick Rob's brain and Ben's brain on this, because I know Rob has been the infrastructure guy and Ben was at MS Build. So I want to bring up this question and to both of you guys to really get your take on this. See, edge computing, having a core cloud at the center and having the edge, so all these smaller deployments at the edge is interesting. So OpenStack being the smaller deployment at the edge, with the AWS or Google Cloud being at being the core cloud at the center, doesn't appeal that much to me compared to having Azure public cloud at the center and Azure Stack at the edge, because then I am seamlessly moving the applications back and forth. Whereas with the OpenStack on the edge and the AWS at the center, it's not as seamless. I may have to re-architect the application a little bit, and again the services I am connecting, they're all different. So it's going to be a lot of overhead for me to use that kind of scenario. So Rob, what do you think will make OpenStack attractive for that edge computing scenario? And that is the question to you. And for Ben, do you think OpenStack has a future in that edge computing scenario, or will Azure Stack will take this kind of use case? So let's start with Rob first.
So I'm a big fan of hybrid. I actually think that the idea that you're going to, that Azure to Azure is the only way to create efficiencies is silly. I think that we're already solving portability problems between clouds. So the idea that you're going to want Azure and work with Azure is not, I dismiss that as the sort of an idea. So if you have something that runs your infrastructure and provides you a base level of automation in the edge, if the APIs are different than the cloud that you're centralizing on, that's really not a big deal as long as it's operationally programmable. So my experience with hybrid is that the APIs, or differences in APIs are fine. Differences in operations can be really expensive to resolve. So that doesn't trouble me as much. The thing that does trouble me is that we still have operational challenges and efficiency issues with running a whole bunch of small OpenStack clouds, right? Every case that we're seeing in OpenStack, it's a big company with a lot of operational chops that's made big investments. We didn't have people on the stage saying, hey, I have a team of 2 people and I run OpenStack and it creates good value. That's always been something that got swept under the rug. And if you're looking at, AT&T or Verizon or something like that with 1,000 or 2,000, or in the Verizon case, they're automating coffee shops, right? So 100,000 OpenStack clouds. That's a very different operational horizon. You can't manage them individually. You have to have incredibly automated stuff. The good news is those edge cases are exactly what would drive the missing enterprise adopters who would look at this as an alternative for VMware. So to me, those things are actually very synergistic. Running small footprints with high degrees of automation and consistency and repeatability and operational footprint make a huge difference in adoption of OpenStack. And that's where the edge cases are interesting. The saving grace in all this stuff is that we might actually get OpenStack to a point where it's small and manageable. And you brought up managed clouds. The same thing. I'm not a big proponent of the managed cloud model. I think it's a failure of OpenStack to be self-managing. But if we can run 100,000 OpenStack clouds, as edge clouds, then maybe we could actually do remote managed clouds from a real commercial interest for people. I just think if we get there, then we should be a USB drive install for OpenStack finally. Or I'm tipping the tip of the iceberg on this. We're just going to install Kubernetes and we're just going to Helm pack an OpenStack cloud onto it, which would solve the problem just as well.
Yeah, we'll come to that
later.
Yeah. So Ben, so what do you think? You will bet on Azure Stack on the edge and Azure at the center, or you see a opportunity for OpenStack?
So I've always said that Microsoft's secret sauce, it's not even a secret sauce, but its competitive differentiation is that it has a compelling existing story and it has a really strong hybrid story, or it will have once Azure Stack happens. And so, AWS plus OpenStack, is kind of this confusing, weird kind of thing. Azure plus Azure Stack just totally makes sense. I'd also say that AWS and VMware, despite Pat Gelsinger saying that AWS is the biggest cancer ever to strike the technology industry, are getting kind of jiggy, and I would suggest that that will continue and deepen. So if OpenStack's thrust is that, hey, we can be the great edge computing platform for AWS or Azure, I think that opportunity is going to dissipate very rapidly. I mean, the other interesting one in here is GCP, obviously, and I'm sure you've got some thoughts on that, Krish. But AWS has a really good story about scale. Azure has a really good story about hybrid. OpenStack has a fantastic story about open source and the ability for people to kind of experiment. What's GCP's story? That's kind of a big unknown as well.
Yeah, I think we should have a panel on that separately one day and talk about it. But on a quick response to that is, GCP's story is machine learning and artificial intelligence. That's what I think is going to drive GCP going forward. Let's definitely come back to that topic one day and have a larger discussion on that. So let's take a
just to go back to Rob's point about how there were not many case studies, at least this time, on stage where there were lean and mean teams deploying OpenStack Cloud quickly and driving automation within the enterprise. I think I remember from last year that I saw the live stream, Time Warner Cable mentioned that they were a really small team that deployed these OpenStack clouds. I think they were what I don't remember at the top of my head, but I think they deployed 1,000 or cluster or something like that in an OpenStack cloud. So that was a compelling use case. I mean, it definitely made me listen keenly and kind of play it back again just to make sure that I was hearing it right. But I agree that while that may not be the tone of the case studies or the stories that were pitched on stage today, this year, it was more, I think the tone was more around, it's more mature, the adoption or the deployments are much more mature and larger. And this is more like mainstream. I agree to Ben's point when I was looking at that keynote as well. I was like, how are these bots connected to OpenStack? And yes, the workloads are running on OpenStack. Yes, but how does it still bring the value? I think it kind of shows the point, or it proves the point that it is OpenStack has become mainstream, and it's not just those corner use cases or edge use cases anymore, but the next gen type of businesses, bots or artificial intelligence kind of businesses are also deploying their workloads on OpenStack. I think that was the point that they were trying to make.
That sort of brings to my next question too. What are the new enterprise customers you came across? The Verizons of the world, eBays of the world, they have been talking for quite some time now. So what are the new enterprise customers you came across in the summit? And the follow-up question to that will be, what are the scale examples you came across? It need not be like the eBay scale, but what are your thoughts on how much people are using it in terms of scale, based on your conversation or based on what you heard on the stage in the summit? Summit. So I would like to pick your thoughts and then go to Ben and Rob on the same question.
Sure. New enterprise customers, I'm trying to think of any names that I haven't heard so far. My perspective could be a little biased because I was working on I was kind of helping the marketing team a little bit on the OpenStack contributor side. So there wasn't a single name that I wasn't at least familiar. I think there were mostly users that were there at least for the names that were there at least for the past 2-3 years. So I guess DirecTV was the one that at least surprised me.
DirecTV now is completely running on OpenStack Cloud, right?
Yeah, so that's I guess completely running on OpenStack was the one that surprised me. But US Army, I mean, it's not a typical enterprise per se, but US Army was the one that made me, at least that impressed me, because I did not expect them to be on stage talking about their use case and everything. Scale, I'm not sure. I didn't have a whole lot of conversations on that, at least at the summit. The ones that I talked to were the ones that had at least their core service or core application running on OpenStack, at least. So it shows the credibility and the trust that the platform has. I will defer to Rob and Ben about the scale question, but I think there are a lot more core services running on OpenStack in an OpenStack infrastructure, because again, contrasting my conversations with a Kubernetes audience where the core services are still not in a Kubernetes cluster. They're kicking tires, playing with it, trying to get the kind of tertiary applications into Kubernetes just to see how it pans out, how it works, but they're not confident putting their core, at least most of the users are not confident putting their core services into a Kubernetes cluster yet. That was definitely not the case with OpenStack deployment. They were either had most of their services, if not the core service that is deployed in an OpenStack environment. I'll defer to Rob and Ben if they agree or disagree, or if they saw what I saw at least at the summit.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple that I hadn't seen before, GE Digital talking about what they were doing, and that was interestingly managed OpenStack behind Rackspace, and then Gap, and so I don't think we'd seen Gap before, but all of their e-commerce, so Banana Republic, Gap, Old Navy, and etc. Are all the e-commerce stuff is running on OpenStack, and so there were some numbers around how the sort of throughput transaction numbers that they have. So that's pretty significant scale. So those are good to see. Don't get me wrong. Just after this long, I'd expect to see more of them.
Yeah. So of the customers you came across before, Rob, before you start, the question to Ben is, of the customers you came across, let's say take Gap for example, where are they going with OpenStack? Is there any single point they highlighted that sort of like that is helpful for other organizations to take it and run with OpenStack?
I mean, that's a really interesting question, because at other events, when you see case studies, you kind of see that you can kind of buy into this vendor and this vendor alone enabled us to achieve this. I kind of got a sense at OpenStack that it was kind of like, hey, this is what's good about the cloud, but is this an OpenStack specific benefit that we're achieving? I mean, I didn't have a really good look at the Gap case study, so I wouldn't want to kind of go out on a limb and say yes or no. But I sense that a lot of the benefits that people are talking about are general cloud benefits and not OpenStack specific benefits.
Okay, Rob, you can take over.
Wow, Ben, that was a great comment. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. OpenStack is, trying to carve a niche out as the open source alternative to open infrastructure alternative. And so these cloud use cases are exactly what OpenStack needs for it to move forward. And to the extent to which it's not ready and easy, it loses those opportunities, because I think those opportunities are a market trend. OpenStack has a chance to be the default for them or not. And at this, I can't think of a specific example to name a company, but I can tell you I talk to a lot of people, and I'm consistently surprised by the number of people who are like, yeah, we just run it. You know, and there's sort of a you know, I'll walk around and I'll try and find out, you know, are you having issues? Is it working for you? What's working? What's not working? And there's a lot of people, especially now, who are like, we run it, we have a 100 node cluster, and it just goes. It's not a lot of drama. And you'll find out like they made some decisions to simplify things, which is the right way to do it. So they turn off features that aren't ready, or they turn off networking options that aren't ready, or they choose a vendor, they make a vendor selection that simplifies things. And you can definitely go through the OpenStack world in a much safer way. And so if you avoid the sharp edges, OpenStack has become pretty usable from that perspective. And I think that gets overlooked because, again, this is one of my comments about Big Tent. Big Tent did a whole bunch of immature projects and showed them off as OpenStack. And so the maturity of the core project is lost when you're always talking about the new shiny. And that was really harmful. And if you talk to people about just core stuff, I've met a lot of people who just had working OpenStack clusters, and then to Ben's point, they're running cloud workloads on them. The thing that stands out, though, if you look at the user survey and in my conversations, you don't even just look at the keynotes, the number one workload for OpenStack is containerized workloads, and of that, by far the leader is Kubernetes. And so, which is a statement about the openness. We had said earlier, it's self-selecting people who want open infrastructure. I'm at Interop, and there's a whole bunch of VMware people who are very happy using VMware, and that's okay too. It's we're in this interesting transition. The OpenStack community wants open infrastructure with open source, and there's a certain degree of willingness to accept pain. But that also means is they look, they're very early adopters. They want to use open layers on top of that also.
Okay.
And so if you look at these use cases, and this maybe is a tee up for the next question, but they're abstracting OpenStack by using container orchestration platforms. And so they're in this summit, much more than any other summit, they care less about OpenStack as a platform, right? They're not hugging the APIs and the projects and things like that than they do about just having a way to abstract run infrastructure in a stable way.
Okay, I think that you stopped at a point like where we can continue with the other question I have. Why is Kubernetes such a big thing? I think we answered it partly in the previous question. So I will add to it some more questions about when people talk about using Kubernetes on top of OpenStack. So what are the different use cases they are talking about? And Rob, I think we also did a podcast on why run OpenStack on Kubernetes. So probably we can briefly talk about it now in the context of the summit. So what are the use cases you saw with Kubernetes? First, let's try to answer why Kubernetes is such a big thing on OpenStack Summit. So, you already partly answered this question. Why Kubernetes on top of OpenStack is appealing to customers?
I mean, Kubernetes, so containers, short of Kubernetes, are providing a degree of abstraction. So going back to one of the first points I made, I think most developers and development teams don't want to mess with infrastructure at all. And so they're looking at ways that they can create code and send it to production without having to inject infrastructure concerns into it, which is what a container does for you or a serverless does for you. And to that extent, developers are racing towards containers just because they don't want to mess with configuration and servers and infrastructure concerns and things like that. Kubernetes has a great multi-vendor community. Multi-vendor community means that there's a lot more people dumping marketing behind it. Just from tech doesn't matter from that sense, right? If you've got 20 vendors all saying it's great, they're going to drown out, poor Docker, air quotes, poor Docker, or Mesos or Rancher, who are much more single vendor things. And so, I think Kubernetes actually is a very good technical solution, but there's an extent, just like OpenStack 5 years ago, you throw enough vendors at something and they're going to create a lot more noise. And it's a reality. But when I look at it, people are the people who want to use deploy applications, they really want to get separated from their infrastructure. So that's what they're trying to do here.
So Ben or Swarna, do you want to add to that?
I'll defer to you, Swana.
I think we are probably guilty of one of those so many vendors that are probably adding to the noise in the Kubernetes community. I don't know who you're pointing to because I see Ben next to you.
It's not me.
I know. Okay, yeah, mea culpa too. But I think it was hard for me not to compare and contrast at least the communities, not the technology or the functionality or the value that each of these technologies brings to the table, but it's more about the communities, how they've evolved from, as I said earlier, or at the beginning, I've been watching OpenStack for the past 3-4 years, and I cannot tell you how eerily similar I found both the communities that are evolving at the same pace. I feel that Kubernetes is where OpenStack was at least 3 to 4 years ago, at least from when I started. The community is coming together, that now you hear a lot of vendors talking about how the value is, how the technology should be used, or how we can use, it's a multi-vendor type of community. So there's a lot of bigger players like Google, Red Hat, etc., pumping money into the foundation. So it is obvious to see certain vendors play a bigger role, but it is also a larger group of vendors that are coming together. And also, if you look at KubeCon, there were a lot more vendor presentations or vendor sessions at KubeCon Berlin than you would find at any other conference, than the end user sessions that were presented there. So it kind of shows the maturity of the community as well, and the adoption of the community. Now you see a lot more end user stories at OpenStack rather than the vendor stories at OpenStack. So I think in that way, both the communities are very similar. Why is Kubernetes so attractive, or why is it the new shiny thing? I guess Rob pretty much answered what I wanted to say as well. It's just a lot of vendor noise and vendor speak, and there are a lot more sponsors behind it, promoting it and advocating it than any other community that are probably single vendor sponsored or single vendor advocated. So I guess that's how at least I felt coming back from Boston, that it was a Kubernetes conference with an OpenStack highlight.
Okay, so Ben, this question is specifically for you. Like earlier, and then Rob can add to it later. So earlier, we saw Cloud Foundry talking about OpenStack. Of course, OpenShift was talking about OpenStack because Red Hat is part of the OpenStack community. So did you hear anything about Cloud Foundry on OpenStack, Mesosphere on OpenStack, and things like that, or anything other than Kubernetes? Any platform other than Kubernetes?
Yeah, so I mean, I left after the analyst day, so I didn't get the full kind of flavor of the event. But I didn't hear anything other than Kubernetes, and I suspect that the other two will say the same. But I'd be interested to hear their thoughts.
Okay, so Rob, did you hear anything from Cloud Foundry on OpenStack, or Mesosphere talking about OpenStack?
There was some, but not to say like. But it's from the vendors. So I heard Pivotal people talking about Cloud Foundry on OpenStack. Although even they were shilling their, they were shilling their Kubernetes deployment stuff. Yeah. Right. So this is a funny thing. Cloud Foundry Pivotal wrote a Bash adapter that installs Kubernetes, and so they're talking. This is how funny this Kubernetes bubble has gotten. It's right. It's even the Cloud Foundry teams talking about deploying Kubernetes on OpenStack at the OpenStack Summit. Mesos, I saw a little bit of Mesos, and I think that's super. That's potentially interesting to people. Rancher had presence there. They usually do. I didn't see a lot of Docker, so the Docker people were conspicuously absent, and there wasn't a lot of Docker Swarm. Nobody was talking about Swarm. So those are probably components of that trend.
Okay. Okay, that's an interesting point about Docker. Yeah, I think probably we should have a separate discussion on what is happening in Docker, with Ben being one of the panelists there. So that's something we'll have for another day. So the next question for me is, eBay scale was really good. Like I was pretty impressed by eBay talking about how they are using OpenStack and the scale and stuff like that. But that scale will be a good scale for regional cloud providers, for the lack of better term. So in the past, I hope that there will be tons of regional cloud providers using OpenStack and providing cloud service focused on a country, probably on verticals and stuff like that. So that was one of the reasons why I was literally pimping OpenStack in the early days, and I thought that OpenStack is going to give that opportunity. Later, it didn't pan out, and the reasons people gave was there is a scale problem with OpenStack, so it's not going to work from a service provider context. A year or two back, the survey talked about, the OpenStack user survey talked about service providers in Asia and other places showing interest in OpenStack. But this year, the same user survey is talking about private cloud deployments being more than interest in service providers. So there are two questions now. Like one is OpenStack the right fit for service providers? And that's the first question. The second question is why we are not seeing so many service providers using OpenStack from Asia Pacific region or Europe, where the chance for a more localized regional cloud provider is higher compared to what we have in US. So anyone can take this question.
I mean, I think it's interesting because you talked, for years ago, you talked about the federated cloud, and that was like a value proposition that OpenStack could have offered or can offer. And I think it is happening. Like I know even down here in New Zealand, like I don't think they've ever been named at an OpenStack Summit, but Catalyst IT, who are a big open source shop down here, have built an OpenStack powered cloud and are contributors to OpenStack. So I think it is happening. I think the problem, the tension that you have is that the foundation wants big case studies, real, high level success stories, and somebody building a working and valuable cloud down in New Zealand doesn't cover that. So again, there's this tension between sort of the commercial drivers that the foundation has and the actual, good case studies that do exist.
I think that's a great point. I think OpenStack Foundation, if you are watching this, please note this. And I think next summit, I would love to see such small players coming and talking about how they are using OpenStack than companies like eBay or AT&T or whoever it is. Yeah, great point. Rob, you have anything to add to it?
I would. I've been talking to the City Network team in Europe, and they won the Super User Award last time. I think we're seeing those players, right? DreamHost is still at it. Rackspace is still using. I mean, these are real use cases. The problem with that is not OpenStack. It's actually that between Amazon, Azure, and Google, there's no air left. And there's plenty of people providing services like that. I talk to the City Network guys a lot, and they're great. They're doing a lot of work. They're providing service for their customers. I think OpenStack provides some essential services for them. I think their business is broader than just what OpenStack is and how OpenStack works. I think you're right. It would be great to see more highlights on it. It's almost a separate OpenStack conference. You almost would have an OpenStack for hosters company and an OpenStack for private.
Probably they could have different tracks, right? Like probably a track for hosters or a track for private cloud use cases and stuff like that.
And a track for telecom. But we're seeing. I mean, that's an appropriate thing that we're seeing. It's and they don't. Sometimes they compete with each other, but sometimes they really don't. And I'm seeing a ton of people like Huawei doing telco clouds all over the place. I mean, they're printing those things. I don't know if that's how profitable it is for them. I suspect it's very profitable, but they're popping up telco clouds like crazy. I think Ericsson has very similar goals. I don't know if the telcos can monetize those clouds effectively, which isn't, but they think they can, and so they're building them.
There was an opportunity at least some time back. Probably they missed out, but they could still do something, especially with IoT coming up and the edge computing becoming fashionable, I think probably there's an opportunity for them. Okay.
I think we really make a mistake assuming that Amazon is the de facto winner. I think that we're only at the third inning of this game. I heard somebody else stealing that. I'm inventing a sports analogy. No, but the saying it's third inning, I think, is a pretty safe assumption.
Yeah, I have one last question that's going to be create some fireworks. Before that, one question to any of the panelists can answer. I know this question should be going to the foundation, but I still want to get your perspective on it. OpenStack could be the right set of right platform to bring Africa onto the cloud. Why are we not seeing any effort by the foundation to onboard Africa onto the technology world by using OpenStack as a platform to bring them on board? Anyone can take this.
Yeah. See, I think we are. Like, I think if we went to Africa, we would see quite a few examples of small but solid case studies of using OpenStack to deliver clouds within countries. In the same way that we are in New Zealand. And I know that Robert, who works with the OpenStack Foundation, has just he said they're keen to look at new case studies, and I've introduced him to the guys in New Zealand that are doing a cloud down here. So maybe we'll see them in Sydney. But it'll be great, and there's a challenge to you, Lauren and Jonathan, Robert, at the summit in Sydney. Let's try and get some African people using OpenStack, in a small way, but to really talk about the fact that they can easily and quickly deploy a cloud, and they don't have that opportunity with the big three cloud vendors. So that's kind of my challenge to them. One last thing I would say to clarify. So the foundation clarified to us that there is no change in pricing for sponsoring the foundation. My response to that would be, I'd be interested to know how long some of these new sponsors stick around for, but there is no change in price. So they are paying the same as what the Cisco's, IBM's, and Intel's and whatever were paying.
That sort of brings to my last question, which I would hope for some fireworks here. If you choose not to answer, that's fine. But what I want to know is, out of the following 4 vendors, who will remain with OpenStack after 2 years? The vendors are IBM, Red Hat, Canonical, Mirantis.
That one's fun.
So I'd put Red Hat, Canonical, and Mirantis in the maybe, with the proviso: is Mirantis going to exist in that time? If they do still exist, they'll still be doing some OpenStack. Red Hat and Canonical both have reasons to do OpenStack beyond OpenStack itself. So OpenStack is an enabler for other stuff they do. So I think they'll still be there, but will they be as bullish about OpenStack on its own? Potentially not.
Anyone else?
So I think there's a big pivot due where OpenStack. I was skeptical at first, but I've become a big proponent of OpenStack as a Kubernetes workload. And if you look at actually every one of those companies that you talk to, they are significantly pivoted to Kubernetes. Mirantis may be harder than all of them. Red Hat's really, really in on Kubernetes. They're clearly leaders in that. IBM has been doing some amazing work in that. Canonical is very invested in Kubernetes, although they're doing it in their own sort of we do different stuff way. Canonical people, if you're listening, I understand you got great tech and reasons for doing some of the stuff you're doing, but it's noise in the channel and people don't get it. But I think that all these companies have really pivoted towards Kubernetes, and the extent to which OpenStack becomes a story with Kubernetes, I think they're going to all be way in on it. But I think they're going to switch their lead story. I think they already are, and you can see that happening. Whether they and then I agree with you on I think Mirantis has got to figure out what they want to do and how they want to message it. The Mirantis keynote was confusing to me. That's actually a much more mild statement than I would use. It was not productive.
Yeah, I think the reason why I asked this question is, like, when I was at Red Hat, we fought with the corporate marketing on where the funds was, marketing funds was channeled. That was OpenStack at the time. Like Red Hat Summit was more or less like an OpenStack Summit at some point. Then this Red Hat Summit, like I saw OpenShift and OpenStack being a small player in the whole thing. So if this trend continues, probably like a couple of years down the lane, probably Red Hat may talk about OpenStack as a niche use case, but I think they are fully pivoting into containers, and OpenShift is going to play a role there. Anyhow, like this was a great discussion, and I think we sort of covered all the important topics here. Thanks, folks, for joining, and we will again come back after Sydney Summit to talk a lot more about what is happening there. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Krish, great questions.